Hello there, how you guys doing? Just closing a few things on my screen here. So as I mentioned in my announcement, can you guys all hear me first of all, by the way? Always ask just to make sure. Okay, so as I mentioned in my announcement, did you guys all get the announcement on this is officially the last day of class, although depending on how far we get or don't get, depending on how much I move away from some of the PowerPoint and talk about some other things that I think are important with respect to networking and the information which is going to be on exam 3. I may have a class period or an online Zoom meeting tomorrow. How do you guys feel about that for those of you that are here right now? Do you have time for that? We have time in the semester. I don't have to get classes, I don't have to get grades in until Monday at 5 p.m., next Monday at 5 p.m. So if I make everything due this week sometime, I believe exam 3 I've made due. I need a little bit of time, so I'm going to give you till Saturday night to take it. I have not changed the date on it yet to officially take it. So if enough people say yes here, sounds like Franklin and Stacy want to do that, I will go ahead and have a class period tomorrow, which will mostly just be a follow-up and review of stuff that we learned over this semester, question and answer session for those of you that have additional questions on what you needed to know or what you need to know to get out of this class and go get a job in the MIS field, if that's what your intention is. Future trends, things I think that are important for you to continue researching far beyond this class. Yes, the exam 3 will be over chapters just 10 through 12. And as I've mentioned before, it's probably going to be, and I'm not saying don't study, I'm saying it's going to be easier than your first 2 exams because there's no essay on it, it's all multiple guess. Right now you guys are hopefully working on your homework assignments, and even if there's stuff that you have not turned in yet that happened earlier in the semester, you can still turn that stuff in and I will still give you credit for it. So don't just not do it because you think, oh, well, it was due already. I didn't do the subnetting assignment, or I didn't watch the video on the networking history. I still want you to do that, guys, if you have not done that, because again, this is information that's helpful for you to know to give you a good background, and also moving forward, you need to know some of this stuff so that you can make correct decisions. I don't want you guys to be put in a position where you're hired to do hired in an MIS management capacity and then make poor decisions based on stuff you did not learn or did not learn in this class. So not taking responsibility. I'm taking responsibility for trying to give you information. Yes, it is still possible to do the Wireshark assignment if you just have one computer. And bear in mind, guys, and the Wireshark assignment for undergrad students is an option. It's extra credit if you do it. For my graduate students, I still want you to do it. But it's primarily conducting these experiments and then writing essay-based answers on it of your experiments. Okay, there's not going to be any right or wrong answers on that assignment. The goal of the Wireshark assignment is to get you familiar with Wireshark and looking at and learning how to use it, and just basically introducing you to how powerful it can be. The assignment just barely scratches the surface on what you can do with Wireshark. It's kind of like an intro to here's how to use a chainsaw, be careful with it, here's how to turn it on and cut a piece of wood with it. But You're not going to become an expert with using Wireshark, but you know that it's there. You know that it's an available tool. Even if you don't use it, you know that it's an available tool that, excuse me, your network managers or your network technicians have available to use. That's what's really important, is being able to show you guys the possibilities, because you're going to be most likely managing a technical staff, which is probably going to know a lot more than you in terms of their technical expertise. You know, that's what they specialize in. That is the technical part. They might not be very good socially, if you know what I mean, but they're good with technical issues. You may also be managing a help desk staff where they are good socially, but they are not very technically minded. Most people that work on help desks, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today, but most people that work on help desks are trained to interact with customers and end users, not necessarily customers. Sometimes it's employees, sometimes it's students, but they're trained to be the first line of defense and help with the failure control function, which in most cases, with at least with end users, is the end user themselves. They've done something wrong, and we're the fallible thing in the network model. We as humans, we are the most fallible. Let me see if I've got. Let me open up a shared window. Let me see if I've got chapter 11 on this computer that I'm using already.
Excuse me, sir, you mind if I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead while I'm looking this up.
Yeah, in regards to the under assignments, I see that there's a couple more extra credit on there. Are those, can we do those, or are those
Which ones are you
there?
specifically referring to? I tried to change dates and put notes on everything that's there. I think the only other thing you might be referring to,
That brick and mortar versus
the
online?
brick and mortar thing. If you want to do that one, that's fine. It's only worth a couple of points to do that, but it's so if you are really struggling for that last few points, you can do that, but I don't want you to spend a whole lot of time on that. I'd rather that you spend more time on Wireshark, more time on the subnetting assignment. If you bomb the subnetting assignment and bomb that part of the test, please redo the subnetting assignment so that you get a better grade on it. If you got a 75 or an 80 on it, you can still resubmit it. Does that help you?
Yeah, also
the firewall, yeah, that's a good point, Franklin. The firewall one that's there, and bear in mind this, that stuff that's there, it's more appropriate for fall and spring semesters because we just don't have a lot of time to do this. Furthermore, we're in the middle of a COVID pandemic where you can't get your hands on a lot of things that you used to be able to. It's not safe for us to be going down to Goodwill and digging through their pile of electronic junk in the back, because I don't know if you guys have ever been to resale stores, but most of the resale stores have a special little section where they sell a lot of used computer and networking equipment very cheaply, $3, $5, $10 for old gateway devices, which you can experiment with. They still have value. The second throuh.io, that is, I decided to go ahead and make that optional. It's good for up to, I believe I put 5 points on there, but I described more specifically what I wanted in terms of detail on that. Okay, so go and read through that throuh.io part 2 extra credit. It's probably, in terms of getting extra credit, it's your best bang for the buck. But you've got to impress me. I've had a couple people turn in a couple of first shots at it, and it's difficult to read and difficult to understand. Try to make it look as much like a professional drawing as you can. What I would do if I were you is first find a nice commercially already drawn, and it doesn't have to be in throuh.io, a diagram of a network situation, either a wireless network or a wired network, even some of the diagrams in the book and in the notes. which I referred to. And it needs to have a fair amount of complexity, at least 15 to 20 items or elements on there. I'd like to see text on there, like if I can use you as an example, Franklin, if you don't mind. The one you turned in was okay, but I wanted to see text. I wanted to see names on stuff. The goal of that draw.io assignment is to teach you guys how to document well so that you can hand a piece of paper or a document to a network technician and say, here, I need you to manage this, or here, I need you to solve this problem. Here's your treasure map on how to find physically where this stuff is, how to log into this stuff, what kind of applications might be running on these servers, or maybe just find out where a particular breakdown occurred. There should be detail in there. I'll go back and double check. I may have, I noticed earlier I had copied and pasted some stuff and overwrote some of the documentation. So I'll check that after class. Let's go ahead and get back into chapter 11, if that's okay. And if you guys have any more questions, keep on emailing me. I've spent most of today, this morning, all the way up until the class, and that's why I was a couple minutes late starting with continuing to answer emails and questions to try to move people along. Okay, I can't spoon feed you all of it, but you let me know if you're stuck on a particular item. Hey, I'm trying to do this assignment or this extra credit assignment, although everybody with real assignments and the official issues get priority first. Send me screenshots of where you might be stuck at if you're stuck. Okay, we were around and about, and I went over denial of service attack kind of quickly, by the way. And there is an example of a network diagram, although that's not one that I would use to manage a network. This is one to prove a point of how distributed denial of service work. But make sure that you go Google for DDoS attack and get a general good knowledge of what a DDoS attack is. Distributed denial of service attack, because they are pretty common. Also, you probably want to Google for, let me open a Word document here, or WordPad document. Port scanning. Let me just write this down. The successful methods of hacking, in case anybody wants to be a hacker. One is DDoS attacks. And the goal of a distributed denial of service attack, sometimes it's just to bring a site to its knees so that it can't do anything else. But a lot of times a DDoS attack is successful in getting a server into a state to where it does become vulnerable and you can log into it if it partially crashes, for example. So it's not just about, the reputation of a site or making a site unavailable. It's possibly for access. A port scan, and that's why I had you guys run that advanced IP and advanced port scanner. Port scanning is done all the time. It's automated. It's happening all the time where scripts are running on compromised machines. Make sure you understand what that term compromised means. If you have a compromised system, that means your system is doing something that it's not supposed to be doing or undesirable. These port scanning scripts or programs are running on compromised systems. Maybe somebody in here right now might have a compromised system. We don't know. Hopefully you have good virus protection on board. But of course, virus protection is only as good as the virus. In other words, if I were to sit down and write a new virus, nobody knows about it yet, and it has to infect and cause problems on a good number of computers, 20, 30, 50,000 systems all across the globe, before it becomes basically a pandemic, like what's going on with COVID-19, before people start realizing what's going on, identifying what it is, figuring out how to treat it, or not really treat it, but discover it to prevent it from getting on your system. The way the virus checking software works is it doesn't necessarily clean viruses, it just lets you know whether you have a virus or not. The best way to get rid of a computer virus is to reformat your hard drive. There's no really good way to clean off viruses because you can't be sure it hasn't compromised anything else. But port scanning is happening all the time. This is probably the most successful method that hackers are using these days to get into systems. That, one, because it's automated. That's the process of writing a script and knock on doors all the time. Hello, 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 hello. Identifying the doors that have something potentially behind them, and then going back to those identified systems, narrowing your list down, and then using automated login scripts on that. The least effective is brute force. Brute force attack. Nobody does that anymore. If you do, it's not effective. You get caught. It's time consuming. It's boring. That's what they talk about, and that's what you see in movies. You see the hacker, and in the movies, always the third password they try is the right password, and they get in, right? Isn't that ridiculous? That's never the case. IRL in real life, okay? So brute force, less effective or not effective at all. Another reason why it's not effective is because most systems have very simple and very good tools in place to prevent the brute force attacking. Once you fail a password 3 times, like on your cell phones, how many people have been locked out of their cell phones for 30 seconds before you can try again, or 5 minutes, or you've got to basically reboot your phone before you can try again. So that's exactly what's going on that makes brute force attacking not a viable security circumvention. Okay, so theft protection, I mentioned this before, mitigating threats at the lowest level is the easiest and cheapest way to do it. And it's also the most effective because not only is it easy and cheap, but if you can prevent anybody from getting in at the physical level, they can't possibly get into any of the other layers or levels. You got to start with the physical level. Also, physical level security is visual. A lot of, how many of you have stickers on your doors of your car, or not on your doors of your cars, but on your windshield of your car, or a sticker on the door of your business or your home that says this house is protected by Brink Security or ADT or whatever it is. But you don't have a working alarm system. The fact that it looks like there's a security system in place will deter a lot of bad guys from trying. Now, as I've said before, obscurity through security slows hackers down. It makes them go look for the easy targets, because hackers in automated systems, they're lazy. They're not very smart. Most hackers they're criminals. They're bad guys. Most criminals are criminals because they aren't very smart. But if I was a bad guy, I would much rather sit in a Starbucks somewhere on a stolen computer or on my own computer, logging into a compromised computer, running and maintaining, operating automated scripts, attacking systems that are not in the same country I'm in. It's a lot safer than robbing a bank where I might potentially be shot and killed or get in trouble. It's a lot easier. So unfortunately, network security is much, much more of an issue because it's easier. There's a lot more criminals engaged in it. Most of the criminals engaged in it are under 18, as a matter of fact. Not all of them, but a lot of them. I mentioned this before, RAID and UPS. Make sure you go look those two things up for the test and understand what the key for redundancy at the physical level, the key for security at the physical level typically is redundancy. In the case of a UPS, what is it redundifying? The grid power. But we don't use redundancy except on mission critical systems. It's expensive. For example, if you needed to drive somewhere, if you needed to get from your home to your business, what's the best way to mitigate the threat of your car breaking down, or you're out of gas or something wrong with that car? You have 2 cars in the driveway that you maintain. But how many of you can afford to have 2 cars in the driveway? It's not feasible to do that. But if you were an Uber driver or a delivery driver and your job depended on you using your vehicle for your livelihood, you might have a backup car in the driveway, or you might have an agreement with another Uber driver or somebody else who's not an Uber driver, that doesn't need their car all the time, to go borrow their car, or you have a contingency in place where you can rent a car. And that's what most of these independent drivers do. There's a lot of drivers that work for Amazon, for example, and UPS, and even the Postal Service, that are independent. They don't work for the Postal Service, especially in rural areas. They are hired as independent contractors for the Postal Service, and they deliver the mail in their personal vehicles. I've seen this in the country a lot, where they just drive up in an old pickup truck, put your mail in the mailbox. They don't have the uniform on or anything. I mentioned disaster recovery plan. I said I was going to send you some links. I'll do that after the class. Send you some links to some DRPs, just so that you can see what the common elements are in a DRP. Fortunately, the frameworks, the COBIT, the Octave, the NIST frameworks, the other frameworks which are available, help us identify what should be in a disaster recovery plan. So if you really want to learn this stuff, go read through those first few pages of what are in these frameworks. And these frameworks are free to download, especially the NIST one. If you want to do business with the federal government, you've got to follow these guidelines, and here's what you got to do. I mentioned these before. Firewalls. Okay. This is where we stop. Network address translation. I helped write some of this. I'm not going to take the full credit for it because I wrote a very small part of it, but it was born about, and it was created originally because these workstations on our local area networks, it was created because we had too many workstations on our local area networks, and our internet service providers here, which used to give us a full class C indiscriminately. They'd say, here's a whole block of 253 usable addresses to do whatever you want with. This is, back in the late 80s. We're like, okay, cool, thanks. I've only got 5 computers, but thanks for all 250. Thanks for that gigantic limo or bus to take me and my girlfriend to the concert, even though there's 2 of us, and we don't need a 24-seat Hummer limo, but thank you. Well, these days, there's a lot more people using the internet, a lot more workstations at businesses, and a lot fewer 24-seat Hummers available to use. So the original reasoning and thought behind network address translation is, let's figure out a way for this device, which is connecting us to the internet, this router. It's running code. It's a computer, special purpose computer. As long as we can put code in that or modify the code to operate on 2 different networks and translate for us or act as a proxy, so that when this computer sends a request out to the internet, there's the source address in this example, 10.0.0.58. The router has an internal IP address of 10.0.0.1. That's your gateway address. He receives that request, looks at the destination, says, okay, you want to send a packet to the outside world, which I'm attached to. I'm attached to the outside world also. But this is an internal IP address. I'm going to strip off your internal IP address, 10.0.0.58. I'm going to put my internal IP address on there, which is a valid, publicly available address. And I'll keep track of that in a table for you. And I'll send that request out to the internet. The internet will act upon that request, send a message back to the router. The router will say, okay, I've got a response here. It's not for me, because I'm not the one making any requests. Let me look in the table to say, hey, who requested a page from IBM.com at such and such time and date? Oh, it was Jake over here. Let me strip off my destination address and stick your destination address on, or send it to you so that it ends up on your computer. And that this process, of course, happens several hundred or several thousand times per second. So the original reasoning for the network address translation protocol is so that we can have multiple workstations behind one router, so that what appears to the internet to be one workstation, one server, one device on the network is actually multiple devices on the network. This is kind of equivalent to, and the way that me and Dave Misher, there's like 3 other guys, we got this idea, was let's make it work like a telephone PBX system, where your company has one external telephone number and everybody on the local network internally has extension numbers, extension 101, 102, 103. You can make outbound telephone calls by usually picking up your phone and dialing out immediately, but you cannot receive telephone calls from the outside world unless there's a special rule in that router that says any calls that come in on a certain telephone number, a certain DID we call it, route those directly to this guy, or answer that call and determine internally, like at the application layer, for example, hello, this is IBM, may I help you? Yes, I'd like to talk to Jake. He's, I don't know where he is. Oh, that's fine. He's at extension 301. Let me connect you. In other words, this is acting as a switchboard. That was the original goal. It had nothing to do with security, no matter what you guys read. And there's a lot of misinformation that you're going to read about network address translation. But take it from me, because I was there. My name is on the, if you were to download the Linux kernel, the source code of the original Linux kernel, which was called Slackware back in the late 80s, and grep or Google for my name or search for my name in the source code, it's there. It's Jake Messenger, responsible for network address translation code of Slackware, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not trying to brag. I'm just saying, trying to refute the fact that there's a lot of misinformation about network address translation. And that's because a lot of people want to take credit for it to earn money for it. I didn't earn any money for it. We didn't design it for us to make money on. We designed it so that we could make the world a better place, so we could use it for our needs. So, but because of the way this works, it is implicitly secure, because these workstations can never be accessed unless they initiate a communication. The internet, if it tries to initiate a communication, the only thing it can physically, or the only thing it can actually send data to is the router here. It doesn't know what's behind the router internally in a network, so there's no way that anybody in the outside world can affect a workstation on an internal network, again, unless you initiate a connection, either intentionally, or you got a virus, or you have some automated program in the background which is initiating a connection, like a remote viewing program, for example. You do have, in most network address translation routers, tables which you can do what's called port forwarding or virtual servers. How many of you have ever heard of that? Port forwarding and virtual servers, or virtual services. Where's my WordPad doc? Port forwarding, virtual server. What you can do with most network address translation routers, this is not a part I worked on, but it's part somebody else worked on. You can put rules, predefined rules, in these routers. It says, hey, internet, if I receive a packet from you and the destination port number is port 80, well, I don't have a web browser running on me, but I've been informed that this computer here, 10.0.0.58 or whatever it is, not a workstation, usually a server, he is running a web server internally. I will automatically forward all that traffic for you. So you can do a forwarding rule from an external address to one or even more than one internal addresses with port forwarding a network address translation, so that the true mnemonic for network address translation is really NAT. network address port translation because it uses the address and the port. So actually originally it was called IP route, because you might find some documentation on IP route. Our version was. Then it was called NAT, network address port translation. Now we just call it NAT, network address translation. NAT exists in pretty much every gateway on the planet. I wish I would have tried to make money from it, even if I just got paid a penny every time somebody bought a gateway or an ASUS or a D-Link or TP-Link or Cisco, although Cisco does their own, they have their own version of NAT, which they're compatible with NAT, but they have their own version, which is weird. I'd be a billionaire multiple times over, but oh well. Again, I wasn't thinking about that when I was 25. I was just trying to solve a problem for my own company's needs. So network address translation, it's a big, big deal because it prevents, it has implied security. You can go Google for things like DMZ or demilitarized zones. This is considered the red network, by the way. This is considered the green network. When we set up networks and firewall software, it refers to the outside world as red. The inside network is green. If it also happens to do Wi-Fi, sometimes that's referred to as an orange network. But red and green are the official standard names in firewall. Firewalling is a concept. Network address translation is the package, or maybe a further defined concept, and the actual code, which is written. And you can download the source code for NAT. It's called open, just search for open source network address translation, or GNU NAT, GNU, GNU NAT. Okay, so application level firewalls, let me skip back up to that. Application level firewalls. I don't typically recommend the use of an application level firewall. Network address translation works in the middle here at layer 3. Physical firewalls work down here at layer 1. Application layer firewalls work at layer 5. So an application layer firewall, in order for them to work, that means the data has to travel from the application all the way through the physical layer of one server, through the physical layer of the network, and then all the way back up to the application layer of another host on the network. That means there's a lot of back and forth already happening. When you have to travel all the way up and down the entire network model with every single piece of information, every single piece of your message, that slows things down. But there is a thing that some gateways allow you to enable called SPI. And pay attention to this. This is important. Stateful packet inspection. Stateful versus stateless. There's a significant difference. Stateful packet inspection is dynamic. In other words, there are rules if this router's capable. There are rules that are applied by looking at the traffic that's coming in dynamically. Not applying a rule indiscriminately to every frame that's coming in, every packet that's coming in, every segment, only applying the rule if there is data in that segment that happens to be for a particular application or that matches a certain string of data. So for application level firewalls to work, they have to look a lot of times at the application data. At the very least, they have to look at the port number. It's slower. It is better to do stateful packet inspection than stateless. Stateless is where I predefine rules in a table, like I mentioned before with network address translation and port forwarding, and you basically code those things into a table, and then it's applied to every single packet and frame that comes into that router without regard to how much traffic is currently occurring. And that's usually where stateful packet inspection shines. You can do things like limiting the amount of packets depending on the time of day or the current throughput. With stateful packet inspection, you can say, well, if it's the middle of the night and there's not a lot of usage on my network, don't bother doing stateful packet inspection. But between the hours of 9 and 5, when my network's very busy, go ahead and do stateful packet inspection, because you might have to make some more intelligent decisions about how to route that traffic, how to block it maybe. So stateless versus stateful. Stateless is a set of predefined rules in a router. Stateful packet inspection is usually where you log into this gateway or router and you check a series of boxes. Should I protect against denial of service attacks? Yes or no? Should I protect against pings of death or other kinds of well-known attacks by looking at patterns, the number of packets that's coming in from a certain website per minute or per second, what the sizes of these packets are, looking for specific behaviors. Which do you think is slower? Stateful packet inspection. I've seen this on slow, cheap routers. Like you go out and you buy a cheap $20 or $30 D-Link router and you enable stateful packet inspection, you will slow your internet connection down by as much as 30 to 40%. And you'll notice when you log into it, if it happens to have a dashboard like the Asus. I really like the Asus routers. I'm not trying to be commercial for Asus, but I like them because they have good dashboard facilities. Where's my document WordPad? Asus. A dashboard will show you the CPU usage of the router, the firewall itself. And if you enable SPI, and this is a good experiment you could do if you want, if you have one of these, or if you decide to install DDWRT on an old router, which is one of the extra credit assignments, monitor the CPU usage, enable stateful packet inspection. Watch the CPU go from 10 to 20% to pegged at 90%, especially if it's an old, 10-year-old Linksys router from a million years ago. It'll be pegged all the time. Also, it's only as good as the pre-written rules and algorithms that are already in the code. A lot of stateful packet inspection, you as a network manager can't alter, can't edit. The only thing you can alter is quantities of things to look at. Like if you receive more than 2,000 packets per second from one specific IP address, that's a red flag. Do something about it. But you can't necessarily say to your router what to do about it. You can just change those thresholds, basically. So do you guys understand the difference between stateful and stateless? Stateful, slower. It's better in a large environment, a corporate environment where you don't know what kind of traffic is coming in. In a small environment, stateless is probably good enough and fast enough. Now, the fastest way to do routing is to have no rules at all. The fastest way to get people in and out of your nightclub is not have a bouncer at all. Just let them come in and out as they please, but it's a nightclub. Or it's the world trying to come into your nightclub. So you got to have some sort of filtering in place. Both of these things, whether they're stateless or stateful, are filters. We're trying to filter traffic. Okay, I'm just going to skip that graphic, not that important. Intrusion prevention. How do we prevent intruders? Either automated intruders in the form of hacking scripts or script kiddies or people that are live. But again, 99.999% of intrusions, they're not live. There are hackers, but hackers write code. And if you've ever watched Mr. Robot, or if you've not watched Mr. Robot, it's probably a good series to start watching because it's fairly accurate in terms of the types of hacking that's going on. You'll notice they write a bunch of code, then they plug a Raspberry Pi or leave a laptop at a company site and then leave, and then check it 2 days later to see if it did anything. That's much more accurate as to what's really going on. Encryption. The term of encryption, assuming that we have to have physical access to a network, assuming that our network filters and rules can't catch everything. Our last line of defense is in the application layer. How do we protect the application layer? through more than just usernames and passwords. We encrypt and decrypt the data coming into and going out of our computer. The strength of the encryption is based on the algorithm that's used. The algorithm is basically a mathematical equation where we take each character out of a data stream, whether it's a letter or a number or a smiley face or whatever it is. We perform a particular mathematical equation on that to alter that character to something else, send that altered character across the network, then perform the same decryption algorithm, the same equation on the other side, and hopes to get that answer in reverse. Brute force attack on encryption don't work very well. Let's talk about the two different kinds of encryption. Symmetric encryption. And there's also dynamic versus static encryption. The dynamic encryption is, no, I'll talk about that in a minute. Static encryption. Let's say I have a file I want to send to somebody, but I don't want anybody to be able to read it should they intercept it somewhere between the sender and the receiver. Or maybe they compromise the receiver's computer. They were able to remotely log into it and read some email or look in some files that normally the end user looks at. If the application data is encrypted using a key, then you have to know what that key is. That key is a password, or we call it a secret sometimes. It's something that you share with the recipient. In fact, if I wanted to send people in the class a file and it had some sensitive data in it, and I wanted to literally just email it to you, I would probably encrypt the file first with a particular password. Jake123, for example. Not a complicated password, but good enough. Encrypt that, send it in an email, then I would text you or send you another email at a later time or to a different email box and say, that file that I sent you a few minutes ago, here's the password, decrypt it with this password. That's called symmetric encryption. I created a key and I share that very same key with you. I give you a copy of the key. How do I let you in my house? I give you a copy of my key. What's the advantage to that, or the advantages to that? It's simple. It's usually done when I'm just sending discrete files, either one file or a block of files. The disadvantages to using symmetric encryption are the same disadvantages that you have when you share a key. How many of you have shared a key with a friend, like a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a parent or a brother? Here's a key, you know, you can use my place for a while or whatever, and then you break up with them, or they prove to be unreliable, or they lose the key or whatever. What does that mean for you? If they lose the key, it's now public. If you break up with them, you don't want them in your stuff anymore. What do you got to do? You got to change your key. It's the only way to get around that. If you gave somebody your password, your actual password that you use to log into Google or whatever, which is also a symmetric key, you got to change your password if you want to ensure that your key is not compromised and not out there. That's what we use again for discrete files and email, things like that. And there's different types of this. So here's how intrusion prevention works. Sender takes a key, a predefined key, takes what's called a clear text message. That's an official term, clear text. Doesn't necessarily mean it's text. It could be a photograph or video, but it's something that you don't need anything special to look at other than an application. You apply the algorithm to it and you create a bunch of gobbledygook out of it that's not readable by anybody from point A to point Z. It's not always point Z that gets compromised. Sometimes point A, sometimes your system gets compromised. Sometimes through the passage of the path in the internet, somewhere in the internet, a router or a firewall could be compromised also. So it's important to encrypt stuff from end to end. That key decrypts that that ciphered message or that encrypted message, decrypts it, creates the clear text message. That's symmetric encryption. Asymmetric encryption is what we use when the data is dynamic or streaming, as in the case of looking at a video or looking at audio or photo, or maybe not 100% dynamic, but you're having a session continuously where you need to continuously being applying a cipher or a key to data that you're sending and receiving. Like when you go to a website which is secure, it changes the HTTP to HTTPS, no longer operating on port 80, you're operating on port 443. Asymmetric key, and you guys all know what asymmetric means, I hope. It means different on different sides. Asymmetric is where you have two keys. The two keys together operate as a pair. You, as a creator of data, have a private key that you do not share with anybody. It's like kind of like taking a key and breaking it in half, and you give somebody, here's the public part of the key, which everybody can have. I don't care, make 1 million copies of it, keep a copy of it on a server somewhere. I'll keep the private key. My data is encrypted with the public key. It's sent across the internet, but the only way the data can be decrypted is with my half of the key, my private key, which I don't share with anybody. It's a key pair. Data sent out using the public key, and you can decrypt that data with the public key, but you do not share, data is sent out with the private key encryption, and it's decrypted with the public key. Where are the public keys stored? You generate, when you create a server, create web pages, for example, you can create a key pair. We call it a certificate, by the way. You keep the private key stored on your server. The public key is sent out potentially with the traffic, with the first web page you hit. How many of you have gone to a web page before in Chrome and you get a warning? Warning, this site is possibly not secure. Are you sure you want to go visit this site? And you can either say, no, I don't want to visit this site, or you click on, yes, I agree to accept the consequences of this action. Show me the encrypted site. You're getting what's called, you're receiving what's called, and this is important, so I'm gonna, I know I'm taking, you're getting what's called a self-signed certificate, as opposed to a public certificate. Both of these are the same things. They're both public keys. The difference between a self-signed certificate is that the server generated it and it's stored on the server. Both the private key and the public key are stored on that server, on that website you chose to visit, whereas with a public certificate, you publish that with a certificate authority. Called a CA. A certificate authority is very much like a registrar, a domain registrar. In fact, many domain registrars, like GoDaddy, for example, are also certificate authorities. What they do is you apply for it, and this usually costs money, just like a website costs money. It usually costs more than a website. You go Google right now if you want for GoDaddy. Google for GoDaddy certificate authorities or SSL certificates or secure website, and you will find that they are charging between 30, 40, 50, or as much as $100 or more per year for a published certificate. So you apply for one, and it is associated with your domain name and or IP address. So you tell GoDaddy, I've got this IP address, or I got this domain name registered with you. I want to apply for a public certificate. They say, okay, that's fine. You pay the money. You generate the certificate. They can generate it for you, or you generate it on your server. You upload it. It's stored on their server, and then they actually propagate that out to several other servers all over the world, just like DNS works. So now when you go to a website of a domain that's been registered with a certificate authority, not only is your computer doing a DNS lookup, now it's going to go do a lookup to see, is there a public key available somewhere in the world off of some certificate authority for this secure website? And if there is, download it, use that as the public key to unlock the data that's being sent to you. If there isn't one, that's when you get the error or the warning. Now, it's not an error, it's a warning. Your computer then, your server can optionally send out its own self-generated certificate, which does not guarantee, by the way. And the reason that public certificates are more important is because they've been vetted. They are public, they are known. A company had to pay money to register this domain name and register this IP address, so that reasonably assures you as a web surfer that you are truly going to uh.edu or ibm.com or amazon.com, that your DNS has not been compromised, because that's what happens with a lot of people. Their DNS gets compromised. And so when they go to amazon.com, whereas that might be a website of 12 dot, I'm making this up, .20.4054, your DNS has been compromised because you have spyware or malware, and it tries to send you to a completely different IP address. And you go to this IP address, different server in the world, it looks like amazon.com because they've copied all the data over, and you go to try to log in, sorry, you can't log in, or you failed to log in, try again. They're stealing your data. The bad guys here, they're not going to register that IP address, and they can't register the domain name amazon.com because it's already been registered by the real amazon.com. So the only thing they can do is register the IP address. And if they register the IP address, they can't pretend to be amazon.com. The only way you could go to that website without getting the warning is by literally typing in that IP address. And we don't use IP addresses to surf the net, at least not to sites that we don't know anything about. I don't tell you guys to go to 129.7.1.7. I tell you guys to go to uh.edu, assuming that you don't know who I was. You know who I am now. I'm vetted at this point. But the internet is full of senders and receivers that don't know each other and never will know each other. This is how we do that, again, so we don't have to share the private key. So even if the public key gets compromised in some way, at least I still have my private key. I don't have to change that. I don't have to re-register and change things at GoDaddy or my certificate authority. I can just tell them to regenerate a public key. So in asymmetric, the sender receives a public key from the certificate authority, or if there isn't one, it receives a key, not a public one, but a key from the server itself, and that's where you get that warning. The data is encrypted on your side first into some different text, gobbledygook, sent over to the other side. The receiver applies, the server applies the private key part, which gives us the same answer. Clear text message. There's different, I've already mentioned this, certificate authorities. These are trusted organizations that issue digital certificates. A digital certificate is just a pair, it's a public key and a private key, two pieces of a key. This is used dynamically or when the sender and the receiver don't know and don't trust each other. It's not appropriate for every time you want to access a website for you to have to contact that website and say, hey, well, I'd like to access your website, but it's encrypted. What's the key, please? Oh, here's the key. It's XYZ123. We couldn't do that. Not in today's world. When there was 100 websites in the world in 1990, that was okay, but now we can't do that. And the whole reason we do this is because we have to encrypt the data. There's just too many breakdowns on the sending computer, the receiving computer, and all the steps in between that your data can be potentially compromised, okay? Certificate authorities. There are different types of encryption that can be done. PGP is one way, pretty good privacy. It refers to a particular kind of algorithm. This is the privacy which is used for symmetric encryption most of the time, PGP. Anybody ever use PKZip or WinZip to zip up a file and it asks you the question, would you like to encrypt this file? They're using something akin to PGP, but this is the most common official standard of the world, is called pretty good privacy. That's Linux based. And then the one that's used for web pages and public/private key, there are two common ones that are used. TLS is the most common now. We used to use SSL. It's less secure in an older protocol, older technology, so TLS is more common. Some servers speak both, so that when your workstation sends a message to the other side, if it is in SSL format, the server will recognize that and decrypt it properly. If it's in TLS format, it will decrypt it and recognize that appropriately. IPsec, again, this is just another encryption protocol. It's used specifically for VPN. There's actually three popular methods for VPN. There's more than three, but there's three that are popular. IPsec is one. Then there's also point-to-point tunneling protocol, which is an older version, which is not very secure because it's easier to hack. And then there is also L2TP, layer 2 tunneling protocol, which employs or uses possibly PGP or other kind of encryption methods, such as Microsoft encryption, Cisco encryption, different flavors of encryption. But those are the three most common there. They don't guarantee encryption. In fact, one of the reasons why nobody uses point-to-point tunneling protocol is because encryption was optional. We don't want optional encryption with VPN. We want definite encryption every single time. That's why when I set up, and you guys are all using L2TP, by the way, to communicate with the servers in the lab, and I checked a little box that says, do not allow the end user, you, to communicate with this router if you will not first initiate or request or agree to use some flavor of encryption. And then Cisco has their own, by the way. How we do that? 3 o'clock. Got to speed up. This is important stuff, though. All these terms in here. I need to go Google for all of these because these will be questions on the exam. Anything, any mnemonic, anything that's 3 or 4 letters that are all capitalized, that's fair game for exam 3. So make sure you go pre-look up those. User profile. A profile is simply a information for a particular user that tells a service or a server 2 things. It tells you, first of all, do you have access, or are you allowed access? And secondly, what specific parts of the network are you allowed access to? Now, the simplest version of a user profile, the original user profiles, was simply a username. You made up a username. Later on, we realized, well, usernames are too easy to guess. Let's put a password on there. So username and a password. Nowadays, sometimes user profiles are a username and a password and some other authentication method that goes hand in hand with it after the fact, like two-way authentication. I'll talk about that in a minute. Authentication. Authentication can either be something that you know, such as a password or a PIN number. Something that you have, like your Cougar card or your access cards that you might have wherever you work that you swipe and you get in. Anybody have an easy tag that they use on the Harris County toll road system? That is an example of something that you have. The way that works is it's got a little chip in it called an RFID, radio frequency identification system. the radio waves that are coming out of the system are strong enough that as soon as you get close to it, within 10 to 20 feet of the transmitter, that's just enough power in that radio wave to wake that little chip up inside your easy tag. The easy tag, it doesn't look like a chip, but there's a teeny little chip embedded in the corner of it. It reads those radio waves. It's like 1/100 of a watt, wakes up that chip. That chip transmits a number out of it, which is then received by that panel there that you pass when you're flying along on the beltway, and it either accepts you or denies you based on that number. That's something that you have. The newest, although this isn't really that new, it's been around a long time, is something that you are. Biometrics. Your fingers, your hands, your face, as in the case of the Apple iPhones, your eye, your retina, your cornea, your retina handprints, your DNA, which hopefully nobody's using DNA checking yet, because that's a slippery slope when you start using biometrics that uniquely identify you in the world, because somewhere, in order for biometrics to work, and this is why we don't see biometrics in use everywhere. First of all, it's not appropriate everywhere, not necessary in a lot of cases for that extra cost. The cheapest cost is passwords. Also, passwords can be changed really easily. If you forgot your password, you can usually override it as long as you can identify who you are through methods like asking questions like, what was your first grade teacher name? Ask additional information, but again, it's always coming back to something that you know. Your mother's maiden name, what high school you graduated from, what year was your sister born, that kind of thing. Here's the problem with passwords. The reason we don't like passwords is because we forget passwords. Pros, passwords can be reset rather easily. Cons, we forget them. It's slow. And if you fat finger a password 3 or 4 times, you get locked out of a system for 30 seconds or 10 minutes or forever until you call a system admin. Access cards, what are the pros and cons to those? The pros are that's faster because you just swipe a card, or in the case of the tollway, you can literally be driving. I've been told you can pass through a toll booth at 110 miles per hour and it'll still pick it up. Don't try that. I'm not condoning that you try it, but I've tried it. I've like late at night in the middle of nowhere, I tried going through a booth at about 130 miles an hour. Couldn't tell if the speedometer maxed out at 120 in the car I was in, but I'm pretty sure I was going about 130. Got home, looked up my account, it caught it at 130. Not smart, could have killed myself, of course, or gotten a ticket at the very least. But those things are pretty dang good. But what are the disadvantages to them? Those can be stolen. Those can be lost or forgotten. How many people have forgotten their Cougar card? Oh shit, I gotta go back home because I can't get in the frickin' parking lot because I forgot my car. I can't get in the building because I forgot my Cougar card. Like right now, if I forgot my Cougar card, I can't get into Melcher Hall. The university's still locked down tight. Only people that can get into buildings are people with access codes that have been programmed. So the cost of those are, you can still forget them, or they can be damaged. They wear out eventually. And they're harder to copy, which there's pros and cons to that. Biometrics, why are biometrics not more common? Anybody have any thoughts on that? I want to know, I want some opinions from you guys. Why aren't we, because we've had biometrics literally for 30 or 40 years. It's been around a long time. In every James Bond movie and Mission Impossible movie you watch, somebody's scanning a hand or an eye or whatever, and computers are making beepy beepy noises before they open the vault to the nuclear missiles or whatever. No, not expensive anymore. Cheap. Biometrics is super cheap, gotten cheaper. That was a consideration, not anymore though. Think about what I started to say earlier. in order for these things to work, in order for this password to work, something that you know, it has to be stored somewhere, right? In order for that access card to work, there's a code in it. That code has to be stored somewhere. In order for your biometrics to work, there you go. You got it right, Stacy. People's reaction. That might be one of them, Franklin. But Stacy's got it. Privacy. That means in order for you to use your thumbprint to get in a building, or your DNA, if we do get to that point, that means there has to be a copy of your thumbprint or your eyeball or your DNA somewhere in a system, in a database. What happens if that database is compromised? And I now have a copy of, I have a digital copy of what your fingerprint is, or your eye, or I have a digital copy of your DNA. Now I can clone you, or now I can pretend to be you. That's the problem. Once biometrics is compromised, it's very difficult to come up with something else. So fingerprint scanners are the most common, and the reason it's just the fingerprint is because we have 10 fingers. If this thumb is compromised because somebody broke into your network and found that thumb, you got another thumb, or you got 9 more chances. Or if you lose that thumb, or you get a permanent wart on it or something, can't use that anymore, but you can use this one. So that's why fingerprints are the most common. That's why we don't use eyeballs, for example. The thing that I used to think, which is probably not very, what you do see in the movies, is how are we going to get into that vault where all the millions of dollars are stored, or the nuclear codes are stored, when that general over there, he has to use his retinal scan to get in there. Let's just go kidnap him and cut his eyeball out and then use the eyeball. You see that in the movies. That's probably not very, it probably doesn't actually work that well. It's pretty gruesome, but that's probably not a practical reason. It's really security and privacy. Once your fingerprint or your handprint or your retina has been published all over the internet, can't use it anymore. The best method for security, this kind of security, the preventative method, is to use a combination of 2 or more of these, along with what's called multi-factor, or that's called multi-factor. Two-way authentication works really well. Two-way authentication is what? A lot of you use two-way authentication. You go log into a system, the system then notifies you in some other medium, aka texts you on your cell phone, says, hey, somebody is attempting to access your Chase credit card from this IP address in Houston, Texas right now. Is that you? And you can simply answer yes or press a button on your phone, because it's reasonable to believe that a hacker may have gotten a hold of your password, but he probably doesn't have your cell phone. Or he might have gotten a hold of your credit card, but he probably doesn't have, he doesn't have all of the information and all of the stuff physically necessary. So two-way authentication works really well. Unfortunately, all of these things are necessary evils. They get in the way. They slow things. Encryption slows stuff down. Everything I have to encrypt that goes over the internet, slow. VPN is slow because of all the encryption that's happening, not just because of the internet, because it's required. If we lived in a perfect world, guys, which we don't, far from it, but if we lived in a perfect world where everybody was honest or everybody knew everybody, there'd be no reason for locks on the doors. There'd be no reason for passwords. There's an interesting, I won't go there because we don't have time, but yeah, if we were in a perfect world, we wouldn't need security. Unfortunately, we are in an extremely imperfect world where the internet not only has allowed me as a user to touch so many different systems and so many other people in the world, it's a two-way street. Now 4 billion people in the world could potentially touch me and my stuff. I no longer am protected by obscurity or physical security, because the best method of physical security is to not connect is to live off the grid, not connect yourself to the internet, not live where people know you are. but how useful is that? I mean, what quality of life is that? Forget about business, just what quality of life is that for people? And businesses certainly can't do that. We certainly can't decide, let's just stay off the internet. Now, some entities have their own internet. That's why the military has their own network. The banking system still has their own banking system, which is not allowed to be on the internet. The system which transfers money, the Swift bank transfer system, the international system which transfers money from bank to bank, that's not allowed to go across the internet. You as an end user can effect a transfer from a web page, but it's not actually coming out of your computer going anywhere else. This is an important thing to understand, that most organizations are moving to centralized authentication, and we're doing that through, I guess it's not mentioned in the notes. It might be, let me see. No, I guess it's not. Centralized authentication. This is important because, and this is what we use at U of H. Back in the old days, we didn't do this at U of H. So if you wanted access to the U of H website and the library and your grades and, the Melcher labs and Wi-Fi, you had to have a separate user profile and password. It could be the same password if you set it up, but those were all separate on every single system. Nowadays, we use centralized authentication through very nice protocols like Radius, which I love Radius. In fact, I'm using Radius. The reason that you guys are able to use your student ID and that password that I set up to not only do the VPN as well as access the EI Lab domain controller and Windows Server there is I set up central authentication on the Windows Server that says, hey, if you receive a special request from the firewall in the lab to the Windows Server, use the credentials in the Windows Server to authenticate that user, not anything local in the firewall. That's a much better way to do it. That way, organizations that have lots and lots of systems to log into, like we do at U of H, there's literally thousands of wireless routers and access points, hundreds of buildings that you potentially can and cannot get out of. All those are separate systems. It's great that we can literally just put your username and your password and what you should have access to and what you shouldn't have access to in one database on one server somewhere on our network, and make all of the devices that normally would store password, make those devices log into the centralized server with the request. That works a lot better. Radius is one protocol for that. LDAP and X500 are two other protocols that we use for centralized authentication. I'm not going to have time right now to describe all three of those, but I want you to go Google for those specifically. If you can't find anything on LDAP or X500, or you find stuff like the Indy 500, go Google for centralized authentication protocols. These are standardized protocols, which is great. Since they're standards, that means I can buy hardware from different vendors and applications from different vendors. So if I go out and I buy a biometric system or just a keypad, as long as that keypad has Radius built into it and I can make it log into an authentication server somewhere, I don't have to put any usernames and passwords in it. I put one username and one password in it to log that device into the central server. We call that, at that point, it's called a secret. A password is something that is interactively entered, typically, and known by a user. A secret is something that's used by another server to server communications. Okay, so in that case, when you hear like, here's a chap secret for VPN, those are passwords that are pre-programmed. In fact, with the L2TP to access the VPN, I said the secret was or maybe I didn't use that term, but that's the official term, secret. Disk 2020. And I gave everybody that same secret. That's what your VPN is using in part to establish the connectivity to the lab. But then I asked you to also include your username and password to do further checking. The secret gets you connected, and then the username and password might, I don't have it set up this way, but that might give you access to only specific areas of the network. I could further define what I want you to have access to. 319. I think we're gonna have another class tomorrow. You don't have to attend it. I would be happy to see at least a few people there to attend it tomorrow, because I will record it just like I'm recording this one, and I will upload it. And I won't make the exam 3 available until tomorrow evening after that class. There's network address translation. So intrusion prevention, or most organizations are using a combination of all of these techniques to build what's called an intrusion prevention system, an IPS. Sometimes we also see it referred to as Unified Threat Management, or UTM. That's not in the book because it's in the newer version of the book, but this is a relatively new term and concept. It stands for Unified Threat Management. It is a combination of applications and code and hardware which perform all of the functions of intrusion prevention: firewall, possibly stateful packet inspection, possibly user authentication, centralized user authentication, virus protection. So you can go Google for, I'll stick the word networking in there, by the way, networking UTM, to give you a good definition. The Wikipedia will define it well enough for you. What is networking UTM? Unified Threat Management, as part of a effective intrusion prevention or intrusion protection system. Okay, recommended practices. It's always important to have a clear disaster recovery plan that's updated when the times change. So like when we have a COVID-19 situation, I bet there's a lot of DRPs that are out of date. They didn't anticipate this kind of global pandemic, but I'm sure they're all getting updated now if they haven't already been at major organizations. They need to be easy to find. They should be published somewhere. If your disaster recovery plan only exists on a server at your business location, and the business location goes up in flames, you don't have access to your disaster recovery plan. If the only guy that knew the password to the file that had everything in it dies and nobody knows the password, it's useless. You don't have a plan. It's important to have a strong security policy, both in terms of stated policy, what employees are allowed to do and not do, and that you enforce that policy through punitive or rewardative behaviors. You either tell an employee you're fired if you share your password, or if you report another employee doing something they're not supposed to do, you know, we'll give you a bonus or whatever. That, I don't know if that really happens or not anymore, but you are encouraged. We as employees of the University of Houston are not only encouraged, but as a state employee, I'm obligated to report if I think somebody's doing something inappropriate on the university network system, hacking into NORAD, for example, whatever. And then user training. We can train users all we want, but ultimately that doesn't work. What really works is the automated versions of security, where we don't have to rely on a user. We rely on an automated system. Users can get lazy. Even I get lazy sometimes, and I set up a system and I think, okay, let me just make a simple password right now, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll come back to it later. And then I forget. to go back there and change that PIN number to something else. And then maybe I'm okay, fine for a year, it's out of mind, whatever. And then it gets compromised 3 years from now. Use of security controls. Again, the control is anything you put in place to mitigate the threat of a likely threat. To mitigate the threat of something that is likely on your assets. And again, your assets of a network are only considered things that have monetary value to your company. And then content filtering, stateful packet inspection, where we're literally looking at not just the numbers, but, and again, this doesn't work as well because again, it's very slow. We filter content based on port number typically. We don't actually, and we can't actually look a lot of times at the data because it's encrypted most of the time. I can't tell, for example, an employee is downloading porn on his computer if it's encrypted from place to place, but I can tell if he's accessing certain IP addresses or websites which have been identified previously as being porn websites, or being websites, maybe porn's not a good example, being websites that I do not want my employees to have access to. But again, that all comes with a cost. You can put 5 locks on the door of your house and think that you're really secure, but what do those 5 locks do for you and your friends that want to get in the house? Slows you down. You're trying to get out of your house because you're having a heart attack, need to get to the hospital, or if an ambulance is showing up to try to get in your house. And this is why a lot of people die, unfortunately, in neighborhoods that are not very secure. They've got burglar bars. Older people put burglar bars on the windows. House catches on fire. They can't get out. Fire department shows up. They can't get in because they can't get the dang burglar bars off the windows in time. And unfortunately, a lot of elderly people pass away because of that. Happens all the time in the 3rd Ward, unfortunately, out near U of H. Necessary evil. Implications for management, the fastest growing area of networking. In other words, if you want to guarantee yourself a job and become an expert in all of these terms and all of these concepts in this chapter and this chapter alone. I'm not saying ignore all the other stuff, but I'm saying you can pretty much just concentrate on all the concepts within this chapter. And I'm not saying that this chapter contains everything you need to know. It's just naming everything you know and then briefly talking a little bit about it. But fastest growing area, and again, that's because with the ubiquity of the internet, you are now potentially victims of not just bad guys in your neighborhood, not just bad guys in your city or your country, but you're potentially a victim of bad guys anywhere in the universe because we're all connected to everything else. Again, it's a two-way street. Pros and cons of being able to touch everybody in the world or touch everything in the world is that potentially everything in the world can touch you. Ew, I don't want everything touching me. Scary stuff. And then the controls are becoming more sophisticated because the attacks are becoming more sophisticated and automated. I, as a bad guy, can be breaking into 50 or 100 systems at one time with the press of one button while I'm playing Fortnite for 19 hours. And only when I get a positive hit do I get a text on my phone, oh, goody, I just made another $500 or whatever it is, or I just pwned another system. I'm going to keep on playing my game and drinking my monster drinks or whatever it is I do. So we're just fostering even more lazy bad guys. And then finally, the network, being able to have access to everything for businesses has become mission critical. And again, that's two-way. I got to be able to let my employees and my customers have as much access as I can give them to everything in my system, all of my assets, as well as me having access to all of the other assets. Excuse me. Excuse me. Having access to all of the other databases and systems in the world. makes me have a competitive advantage over the next guy if I have more tools to choose from. That's what that boils down to. Okay, that's it for chapter 11. It's 3:28. Let's just jump into chapter 12. Chapter 12 will go faster. Chapter 11 always goes a little slower because this is kind of my area of expertise, not on purpose, but just because I've grown up with it. And I was a thrill hacker for a long time. I was what you call well, I was a red hat for a while, meaning you couldn't tell whether I was good or bad, but I'm what you call a white hat. I try to hack. I don't do this much anymore. I used to. I try to get into systems just to see if they're open or not, because I'm trying to point out, hey, U of H. And I do this all the time at U of H when I walk around physically. Lately, I might go up to different doors in different buildings and pull on them and see if they were open. For example, the Bauer College of Business, all those buildings are supposed to have been locked down. One of the doors in the CT Bauer College of Business was malfunctioning, and you could just open the door and walk right in. You had to know which door it was, and I'm not going to tell you. And I reported it, and it took like 3 or 4 weeks to finally get fixed. Either they didn't believe me or they didn't have anybody to check it. But in that 3 or 4 week period of time, people could have been coming in and just ripping all of the stuff off the walls, sleeping in the bathrooms, using the bathrooms, whatever. There was my lab door was malfunctioning for a couple of weeks, where you could just walk right into the EI, walk into the Melcher building, walk into the EI lab without having any key cards or anything. They've since fixed it. I squeaked about it enough, and it was, pretty major. When they say you can't come in the building, but the building's unlocked, U of H, like most colleges, is in a bad neighborhood. By the way, why is U of H in a bad neighborhood? Anybody know? Why are most colleges in bad neighborhood? Anybody ever been to Berkeley? Crappiest neighborhood in the San Francisco area. Anybody ever been to, well, any major college? It's because they were there first. I used to say to people, I jokingly said, it's really inconvenient that they put the Alamo right in the middle of downtown San Antonio. There's no parking. It's hard to get to. You can't find it. There's a lot of traffic. Why didn't they put it out of town somewhere? Like in a separate little park 40 miles outside of San Antonio. That's because it was there first. Duh. Same thing with the universities. In 1927, the Third Ward was a nice place to live, and it was convenient, and it was state-owned property. Anyway, has nothing to do with the class. It's an interesting observation I make when I travel around to different universities that I think are nice universities. It's like, oh boy, some neighborhoods are way worse than others too. Very sketchy. University of Chicago. Don't be anywhere near it at night, especially Chicago. Chicago has one of the highest murder rates in the country. See how far we can get in chapter 12. It's gotten a lot better. Has anybody ever had their car broken into at U of H? Or worse, anybody ever had a problem at U of H? Yeah, it's unfortunate, but they know you're a captive audience because they know you're going to be in the building for at least an hour and a half or more. Just like the movie theater. Let's see. Content. Chapter 12. We're almost there, guys. Appreciate you guys holding out this semester. This is a tough semester for all of us, I think. So again, we're going to have a class tomorrow at 2 o'clock. The exam 3 study notes, I know that's a little, that date's a little old. I'll go in there and I'll update that date. But for the most part, exam 3 hasn't changed much. I might add one or two things in there with respect to like unified threat management, for example, which is not in those study notes. I've talked about it a whole lot today, unified threat management. Hopefully I've talked about it enough. But you can go click on that now and it'll tell you about exam 3. I don't think I'll give 3 hours. I don't think you need 3 hours. I think psychologically sometimes giving too much time on a test makes people do worse on tests because you get lulled into a sense of, oh, I got all the time in the world. And then you realize, holy crap, it's 11 o'clock on Sunday night. I haven't started the test yet. Or you start taking the test and you realize, oh, I guess I should have studied. So, security. Is this chapter? No, I'm sorry. That's chapter 11. I apologize. We just talked about chapter 11. Where's chapter 12? There we go. Network management. What you need to know about network management initially is that there's two general groups, and you may be working in one of those two general areas. You may be working at the network operations center level. Sometimes they call it upstream or downstream. Or you may be working at the end user level at the failure control function, aka the help desk. So what do network managers do? What are you guys going to do when you get your jobs, if you get your jobs in this? Designing networks for performance, network management standards. I'm going to talk about managing network traffic, configuration management, performance management, how those things are different, what they mean, end user support, cost management. That's probably the biggest issue these days with most network managers, second only to security, is cost management. Network management is defined as, how do we do on time? Let me watch the time, 3:35. Defined as the process of operating, monitoring, and controlling the network to ensure it works as intended and provides value to its users, that it's working and functioning nominally. If a network doesn't provide value, in other words, if it's more trouble than it's worth to operate, your users won't use it, nor will it give them the information they want. Network managers, operationally, what do? You may be responsible for managing the day-to-day operations of a network, including things like processes that occur every day, backups, reports that are generated, adding and deleting users, giving people access, helping users use the network, providing support to the network users, ensuring the network is operating reliably and nominally, we call that, evaluating and acquiring new network hardware, software, and services. That's a significant part of your job as well, although you don't do that every day. You might do that once a month. You might do that once a year or for a couple of weeks at a time, usually when you get your new budgets. Although you should, as network managers, always be paying attention to technology changes, specifically in pricing as well. Like, for example, I did not know this, but you can go out and you can buy it on Amazon.com, a 2 terabyte external USB 3.0 backup drive for $69. That sounds ridiculously cheap to me. I don't know how good it is, but that's where the pricing is these days. That's consumer grade, not commercial grade, but even still, that's cheap. You may be managing a network technical staff who, like I said before, many times are going to know much more than you are ever going to know technically. That's what their job is. They're the engineers and the technicians and putting the nuts and bolts together, but they don't know anything about, well, I should say, they don't not know anything. Their area of expertise is not customer service, is not management, is not cost performance. That's not their goal. Their goal is to make sure everything technically is working. And you may also be managing a network budget with emphasis on controlling cost. Most MIS managers work directly underneath control of the boards of directors or the CEO or the company controllers. The top network manager position for most companies is called what? The C something. There's actually a couple different terms. There's the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, or the CTO, the Chief Technical Officer. Many of you, your goal is to try to get to CIO or higher eventually, but CIO. CIOs make a shit ton of money, depending on what company you work for, but they're usually one of the better paid positions, if not the best paid, second only to the company controller or the CEO of a company. And that's because networking and information is the company for most companies. It makes or breaks a company. How your network operates, your data, who has access to the data. Strategically, network managers need to try to develop strategic long-term networking and voice communication plans to meet the organization's policies and goals. That means you need to be forward-thinking and paying attention to trends and future technology, and not just technology, but future and current laws that may be changing, like HIPAA, for example. Does everybody know what HIPAA is? H-I-P-P-A. No, H-I-P-A-A, excuse me. The Health Insurance Privacy Patient, I can't remember what it stands for now. What it basically is it's a federal mandate that says you as a company, if you have anything to do with patient data, you're an insurance company, you're a hospital, you're a provider, you're a patient, you have a mandate and a responsibility to help protect patient data. That has a significant impact on managing a network. There's very specific rules in HIPAA about passwords, protection of data, what happens if data is, if there is a data breach, very specific rules to it. Every industry has this, but HIPAA becomes probably one of the most common ones you hear about because everybody's a patient at some time or another in their lives. Keeping abreast of the latest technological developments in computers, data communications. The way we do that, by the way, as network managers is we subscribe to periodicals. We subscribe to online data services and news services, which everybody in here needs to be doing. You need to be subscribing to tech checks, and like CNN does this tech check briefing weekly, and maybe CNN's not the best one, but PC World and Kaspersky and all of the organizations that do network cybersecurity monitoring. You need to be on these mailing lists. You need to be doing active research, not daily, but need to have your ear to the wall so that if something is, this is a potential problem around the corner, that you're aware of it. You don't want to ever get blindsided by an issue, especially if you get blindsided by your CEO and he comes to you and says, hey, so what are we doing about this new XYZ virus, which has been going around in the medical industry? And if you go, I don't know what that is, you're going to get fired. Don't ever say to a CEO, I don't know what that is. Say, we're developing a strategic plan and I can put together a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint presentation this Friday and show you. And then you end that little short meeting and then you bust your ass to go figure out what's going on. Make a nice PowerPoint, invite a bunch of people and get some Subway sandwiches. And you will be assisting. And again, you guys are working directly underneath the major players of the organizations, assisting senior management in understanding the business implications of network decisions and the role of the network in business operations. And this is primarily, as I said, the networking function is the most expensive and the most vulnerable and the most important. I'm not trying to take away from other areas like finance and marketing and sales and all that, but arguably MIS people hold the balls of the company in their hands. I mean, not to be rude, but I mean that's kind of what's going on. I'm trying to express to you the importance of networking and proper management of networking. It will make or break a company. By the way, that means that your average salaries will be higher than accountants, than sales and marketing people, than journalists, than teachers. People that teach networking like me, I get paid more than people that don't teach networking. It's a good job industry, and you have job security literally for the rest of your life. Computers and networking aren't going away anywhere. It's an exponential vertical shot to the top. Unless we have one of these post-apocalyptic World War III situations, which like World War Z, but that's all fake and that's not going to happen. Even the COVID-19 thing, which people are saying is apocalyptic and whatever. What's that doing for network management right now? It's given us jobs. Network managers are busting their butts right now to figure out how can we provide remote access to our employees and maintain security and do meetings that we, replace face-to-face meetings. How do we deliver our product? How do we deliver medical care to patients? We've got to come up with telemedicine, which is a thing. Teledentistry, I don't know about that. Telemedicine, definitely a thing. Managed networks. I don't know how we do that. We're getting pretty close to the end, but I think I'm pointing out some very important concepts that are important. I ask questions on the test, and this is the important stuff that I always talk about on the last couple of days that you need to know to get jobs, that you need to understand. Managed networks, managed devices. Devices. Again, people are the fallible part of a network. So the more that we can get our hardware and our applications to do for us, the more likelihood is it's going to get done right, and it's going to get done uniformly every time, because computer programs and devices, they don't need time off. They don't get sick. Yeah, they fail occasionally, but you get two of them. Or you put them on a maintenance contract. They don't get mad at their boyfriends and girlfriends. They don't get suicidal. They don't have bad and good days or whatever. In other words, humans are fallible because of our emotions and our inability to perform the same task uniformly every single time. Or maybe it's not about being sad or suicidal or whatever. It also works the other direction. If I like somebody or I want to give somebody preferential treatment, I can say, oh, you don't have to follow those rules. You can use a simple password, or here, I'll let you in the door that one time as a favor. Well, that's a bad thing. You'll get in a lot of trouble for doing stuff like that, depending on the industry that you're in. That's just as bad as, well, I don't feel like coming to work today because my girlfriend broke up with me, so I'm going to do my job really badly because I'm depressed. Doing favors is just as bad as being lackadaisical at your work. So managed devices, they cost more up front, but I always suggest that you purchase, if you have purchases coming up, buy devices that can be remotely managed, that can be automated so that they can report to you when there's problems. Another advantage to managed devices is that if they are self-managing and self-monitoring or looking at each other, you can manage by exception. Have you guys heard that term before in other management classes? Manage by exception. That should be your mantra as a management graduate. Manage by exception. In other words, pay attention to the yellow and red flags. Forget about the green flags. If everything is operating as it should, don't need to pay much attention to it. You can occasionally audit it, but you need to manage and look at the stuff with it. Hopefully not red flags. Hopefully you're only looking at stuff with yellow flags. Bad management is only dealing with red flags or black flags if things are literally dead. That's our 4 colors in networking. Green is nominal, yellow is warning, there might be a problem, like a hard drive is failing, but you got a backup somewhere else. Red is a drive has failed, and black would be a building collapsed or a theft of data, something that's really egregiously bad. A lot of people didn't realize there was something worse than red, but there is. It's black. Not being political at all there, by the way. I don't want anybody to think I'm being political by using colors to mean anything other than what they are, colors. Designing for network performance, designing management or device management software, we also call that point management software, is used in conjunction with managed devices, which help us monitor traffic, monitor usage, monitor throughput, monitor potential issues. It's device management software like MRTG, for example. Systems management software allows us to manage entire systems, which oftentimes include cost management and project management. SAP type stuff is what I'm talking about. Application management software, and this is of course very dependent upon the application, but application management software helps you manage process flows, for example. These are used a lot in the oil field and finance industries to help you manage whether applications are doing what they're supposed to do. They're looking at quantities of transactions that are being generated, numbers of users that are using the systems at any one time. Here's an example. I believe this is HP OpenView. An example of a type of management software that can log into multiple devices, multiple routers, produce logs here, which again, we as network managers, we don't pour through logs. One of the biggest issues that network management, not managers, but just management has in general is that the amount of log data. What is log data, first of all? This is probably the last thing I talk about today, but what is log data or logging data?
Basically all the functions or procedures that the computer has, or whatever the machine is going through, it just kind of lists every single one of them.
It's a byproduct. Yeah, you're close. It's a byproduct of the processes that are running on those servers or in those applications. That has nothing to do with the useful data for your end users. In other words, it's not how much money is going from point A to point B or sales. It's keeping track of that process that's running. Times and dates that certain people log in, for example. Times and dates that certain systems are accessed. Logs of errors, application logs, access logs, error logs, warning logs, web access logs. There's literally 2 or 3 dozen different kinds of logs, excuse me, that you can look at. The amount of log data these days, because of all these managed systems, can be as much as the actual amount of real transactional data that your company's generating. Not only do we have to figure out where to store this extra log data, let's just say conservatively, your log data is 20% of your transactional data. So if your company is generating 10 gigs of transactional data per day, you're a bank, for example. You're also creating 2 gigabytes of log data, which is only necessary in some of the cases, in case you need to go back and look at historical actions to see what happened. If you had an unauthorized access, for example, or you had a hardware failure somewhere, or you needed to just look at trends and analysis. How many people are accessing our website daily? Is this something we should pay attention to? It's for sales and marketing. as well. So log data is a really big deal, and there's a lot of it. Network managers, we used to look through logs on a daily basis. I don't manually look through logs at all, ever anymore. It would be impossible for me to look through all of the logs, even on one server, on one web server. The amount of log data just constantly flying up the screen at the speed of light. Can't review that. So we use applications which look for yellow flags or red flags, or I should just say look for flags. Or they look for things I tell them to look for. A lot of managers, not network managers, but company managers ask me for data. I'd like to know how many patients were seen on such and such date, or how many times this particular patient was seen for something, or how many times this particular application was accessed, for purposes of trying to figure out budget allocation. Are we seeing as many patients as we can potentially see? Are we not seeing enough? What can we do to increase our revenue, for example? So it may just be for statistical analysis. Forget about managing to make sure the network is operating properly, but that's part of your job as the network manager, to be able to make available that statistical sales and marketing analysis for your that function of your business, in addition to keeping track of whether all the servers are operating normally and drives are failing, or you got hackers going on. So a lot of log data. It's incredible to me. Logs, a lot of times logs will fill up hard drives and systems will crash. In fact, most of the time when I find a system is inexplicably crashed, there seems to be nothing wrong with the hardware, it rebooted itself, it's because the log files filled up. And many log files, by the way, are just stored in memory and RAM. They're not hard written onto files. They're stored in RAM. Once you run out of RAM in a computer goes, my brain's full. I'm going to go to sleep and wake back up and forget everything in my brain. That's a reboot of a computer. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I'll continue with a class session tomorrow at 2, and we'll pick back up with SNMP. There's not a whole lot more to this chapter, but SNMP and content management is important. Desktoping, and also I wanted to talk about this because these two items are very important. Network Operations Center versus help desk or end user support. And one of the most important parts of network management is the total cost of ownership, TCO. Talk about that tomorrow. So thanks for bearing with me on that. In the meantime, everybody keep working on whatever projects you're working on. Keep sending me emails if you're stuck somewhere. If I have not answered an email from 2 weeks ago, it's possible and probable it got filtered off and buried into a spam folder somewhere. Email me again. If you still don't get if you send an email to me today and you don't get a response by tomorrow, text me. I've had students in the past before said, I emailed you 5 or 6 times, never heard from you. Looked in my spam folder, and for whatever reason, I don't always know why, their email was in the spam folder. Okay, see you guys tomorrow, or some of you tomorrow. Otherwise, thank you all for participating in this difficult period that they were going through. I hope everybody does well in exam 3. Grades are not written in stone, by the way. Keep that in mind too. If you end up with a grade that you don't think that you deserved, I always have the opportunity to go back. There's a certain amount of time that I can go back with valid reason. In other words, you've got to be convincing to me to be able to change grades. So if you end up with a C+ and you're like, well, wait a minute, you didn't grade something, or I don't think I deserve that. You can show me that you think you deserved a better grade. I can go back after July 6th and change your grade if it warrants it. I don't change grades very often, but every once in a while there's a technical issue and I do make a mistake every once in a while, or a fat finger or something. So don't freak out if you've got a grade that you're pretty sure you did not deserve. If you got a grade that's better than you think you deserve, keep your mouth shut and keep going. And just feel lucky, okay? We'll see you guys tomorrow. Go Cougs.